I think on a global level, yes. But probably on a local scale, no. I mean, if you have a nuclear accident of a very serious kind, then it's quite dangerous on a local level. But carbon dioxide is much more dangerous globally. So I think this is why Lovelock is making these statements. And there are other proposals. One is to put sulfate aerosols up into the atmosphere to cool the Earth, and it wouldn't take very much to do it. And we've just had a meeting here at SUM in the last few days in which an American scientist, Ken Caldera, was suggesting that we could even cool specific regions if we wanted to in this way. For example, we could save the polar bears by putting sulfate aerosol above the Arctic. And this would prevent the sea ice from melting. And I think we've reached the point where we are going to have to use such geoengineering, if you like, solutions, although the pipes isn't exactly geoengineering. I used to be against these approaches, but now I'm so shocked by the severity of what's happening and the danger of what's happening to the Earth that I think the time has come for us to seriously consider these options. Well, people are thinking about this. You're quite right to talk about iron, because iron is one of the limiting nutrients in the ocean. You know, the tropical oceans are basically marine deserts. There is life there, but there's not much of it. And this is a puzzle because there's quite a lot of nutrients there apart from iron. And if people have tried dumping iron into the tropical ocean, and they find that we get great blooms of algae if that happens. So one suggested fix to the climate change problem is to seed the ocean with iron, the tropical oceans with iron. And then that will produce two things. Well, algae, basically. Sorry, start again. The proposal has been to seed the tropical oceans with iron, just to dump lots of iron in the tropical oceans. This would stimulate algal blooms, and they would suck out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and produce clouds, thereby cooling the Earth on both accounts.
I've seen calculation that this is quite cheap, actually.
Quite cheap, yes. But putting iron is a highly bioactive element, and we don't know what effects that iron will have down in the deep sediments, where there are very important ecosystems at work. It could really disturb the whole balance down below. So it's not a very wise thing to do. But Jim Lovelock, I don't know if he talked to you about this, but Jim Lovelock has proposed the idea of putting pipes into the ocean. Not very deep ones, just below the warm layer of water that I talked about earlier. Just slightly into the cooler water, nutrient-rich water down below. And wave action would bring this cooler water up to the surface and feed the algae. And the idea is that this cooling would then spread throughout the whole planet through positive feedback. You would start it in a few key places of the world ocean, and then that would cool the region. But then by cooling the region, the cooling would spread outwards, and so the effect would spread globally. Well, one scenario is that we learn to fall in love with the Earth. This is the most important thing that we can do. It could be our first step before we start reducing our carbon emissions. Imagine, sorry, go on.
What does falling in love with the Earth mean?
It means no longer seeing it as something outside ourselves. I mean, take the word environment, for example, which a word I really dislike. It suggests that the environment is something not to do with us, that it's some other thing that surrounds us, but that we are not really connected to. So I don't like the word environment. I haven't really got a better word for it. Perhaps I haven't got a better word for it in English. But we need to realize that we are deeply embedded in the Earth, that we are, just as our gut microbes are to us, so are we to Gaia. We are embedded within this great round living creature, though I would say a sentient living creature. It's as if in science we've just discovered a sixth kind of life. You know, I mentioned there are 5 main kingdoms of life. Now there's a 6th one, which is life at the level of a whole planet. A new kind of living being, a planetary being. And we are deeply immersed in her. And we need to take on board this idea. And we can use our science, the science of Gaia, or Earth system science, if you like, to really develop a sense of deep belonging to the Earth. Because the stories that science has given us, like the ones I've outlined, are so miraculous and inspiring. So awe-inducing, that we can use them to help us fall in love with the earth.
So one scenario for you is that human beings from now on become devoted Gaians.
Yeah, we've become devoted to Gaia, absolutely. All of us become devoted to Gaia, and we work for Gaia, and we realize for who we are embedded in. Can use the science, if we choose to help us fall in love with the earth, to really realize that we're living inside our great relative. You know, and we fall in love, we love her just like we love an ancient grandmother or an auntie, or maybe even our parents, perhaps. And then we realize that if we're business people, we can think of it like this: we're working for Gaia Inc. This is the boss, you know. The whole Earth system is the boss. Or another way I put it is that we can be Gaia'd. In other words, that the Earth herself is an active agency, almost a psychological agency, a psyche, that can sweep away the illusion of separation that we have and give us this gift of connectedness with her great vast body. So that one scenario is that happens on a mass scale, and everybody then understands the need for reducing our carbon dioxide emissions and for stopping the destruction of wild nature.
So in this scenario, the kind of global love for the Earth motivates to do radical measures on the carbon issue?
Well, we might still need to do geoengineering at this stage, because I can't stress enough how serious the situation is becoming. So we may well need to put sulfate aerosols into space above the Arctic and the Antarctic, and we may well need to use Lovelock's pipe solution. And you may well need to try experiments like this, even though there are risks involved. But the other scenario is, of course, that we carry on with business as usual. Or, not even with business as usual, that we all reduce a little bit and start to feel good about it and think that we're actually doing something. So we just reduce a little bit of carbon here, drive a bit less there, but none of that's going to be nearly enough to solve the problem. And then...
So if the first scenario is Gaia Inc., the second scenario would be the do-gooders scenario?
The do-gooders scenario, yeah. You do good. It's like giving a little bit of money to charity, but you don't really care that much. You just give a little bit now and again.
Reinvestments, cut carbon emissions by 20%.
Exactly. Yeah, sort of half measures, really. Tokenism. And then we end up with very severe, drastic and sudden, abrupt climate change.
When does this happen, approximately?
Well, it could happen. It's already happening. We're losing the Arctic sea ice exponentially fast. Shockingly fast. I mean, this last summer we lost a vast extent of sea ice. Already the Northwest Passage is more or less opened up, and already the oil companies are moving in to try and exploit the oil reserves there, which is the ultimate irony. So it's already happening. I don't think we should think, when is it going to happen? It's happening. We're already losing vast amounts of biodiversity. It's actually happening. The permafrost is already beginning to release some methane. So we're at the beginning of what could become an abrupt change. I mean, many of the scientists involved in this field no longer think of gradual climate change, but of abrupt changes, you know, from one state to another. So we could tip into a warm state very, very quickly. Maybe say within 8 to 10 years, we could begin to see very severe changes. We're already seeing severe weather events around the world. I mean, in Britain this last summer, we had extremely severe flooding. You probably heard about it. There was at least one Force 5 hurricane in the Caribbean this year. Had it struck the United States, it would have made headlines. But of course, because it struck Central America, no one could be bothered, because no one cares about Central Americans. They care about Americans, but not about Central Americans. Yeah, and so these severe weather events are happening all over the world. They're also increasing exponentially fast. So it's not a question of when. We're actually in it now, in the beginnings of it now. And so I think the time has come for us to experiment with geoengineering. There's a radical change away from this globalized so-called free market economy, which is based on the idea that we can keep extracting wild molecules from Gaia for as long as we like and in any quantities that we like. This idea of limitless exploitation of nature, which is the fundamental assumption in our economic system, would be abandoned. It's clearly unsustainable. And instead we'd move away from that kind of suicidal growth to what I call intelligent growth, in which what grows is, first of all, on a psychological level, love of Gaia, connection to place, a massive relocalization of food production, of industry, and of community. You don't have to be an animist to adopt this. You can be a mechanist, but still understand the need for it. But if you're an animist, it makes it easier, and it gives it more meaning, because then the whole Earth and the whole cosmos is fundamentally meaningful, and there's no longer a split between human culture and nature. Culture goes, in this view, permeates everything. Humans have a certain kind of culture, but so do bacteria, so do trees, so do birds, and so indeed does the whole Earth. So this animistic perspective allows us to dissolve the dichotomy between ourselves and the rest of nature. And this gives us fantastic motivation, energy, and satisfaction. So we would relocalize on a massive level. The huge transportation networks that we now require to move food around would disappear. Much of the food would be produced locally. Most of our clothes, most of our industrial products, of course there'd be far fewer of those, would be produced locally. And wild nature would be allowed to regrow. No more of it would be cut down. Our agriculture, of course, would be not like it is now with vast inputs of fertilizers and chemicals. It would be more like what's known as permaculture, which is where you grow lots of different species, all of them useful, together to mimic the synergies that you find in a wild ecosystem. It's been very well proven and highly productive all over the world. And at the same time, we would probably be strongly motivated to carry out some geoengineering. Because as I keep saying, I think the time has come to take radical steps to prevent the runaway warming from getting too severe.
Do you really believe this is some plausible scenario?
I don't think we've got an option. We have to do this, otherwise our civilization simply won't survive. So it's not about going back to a previous state of existence, you know, say pre-industrial existence. It's moving forwards into a new, thoroughly exciting, thoroughly challenging situation, full of possibilities that we haven't plumbed before in our culture. What it'll mean is that we'll have to reconnect not just with the earth more, but with each other more. We'll have to find our satisfaction not so much through our computer screens, but through face-to-face interaction, through storytelling, through music making, through community, and through connection with the earth. All of us will have to be involved who are able-bodied with food production in our local area for at least 1 or 2 hours a day. We'll all have to really allow nature to regrow in our local regions and really develop an intimate knowledge of our local regions. We'll have to create stories again about, if you like, the spirits in the local trees, about the local rivers, about the local mountains and valleys. We'll have to recreate rich local cultures once more. What I'm trying to do, like many others, is to heal this terrible mistake that we made in our culture around about the time of the scientific revolution, more or less, when we began to seriously believe that the Earth is nothing more than a dead machine. Not just the Earth, but the whole cosmos. You know, when René Descartes' followers cut open live dogs, and the dogs screamed in pain, Descartes said to his followers, "Ignore the screams, they are merely the creakings of a machine." So you can understand what a travesty it is to deny your spontaneous feelings of sympathy for a dog in screaming in pain in that way, simply because you believe it's a machine. So we've believed that the whole Earth is a machine, that the whole Earth is just there for us, that we humans are the only species with sentience, and that everything in the Earth, all the trees, the forests, the rocks, the minerals, are all there for us to exploit, that we've actually been placed here on this Earth to use the scientific method and scientific rationality to exploit the earth merely for human benefit. And it's no surprise that 400 years later, we now have this tremendous crisis. I'll say it again. It's no surprise that after living under the influence of this worldview for 400 years, it's no surprise that after living for 400 years under the influence of this worldview, that we now have this phenomenal crisis. So we need an antidote to the mechanistic worldview. I don't mean to say we should abandon it, because it's a useful way of seeing the world for certain purposes. It's useful as a tool, but it's not useful as the guiding metaphor for an entire culture. So we need to look for a metaphor that is more appropriate. And in order to do that, we can look either to other cultures or dig down into the history of our own culture, like doing a sort of cultural archaeology, and look for ideas that could serve to become, once again, the appropriate metaphor. And the idea of anima mundi is the most suitable. That comes from ancient Greeks. In fact, they spoke, not Latin, anima mundi is Latin, but Greek. They used to talk about psyche cosmou. Plato writes about this in the Timaeus, psyche cosmou, the psyche of the cosmos. And we've touched on this idea earlier, that the whole cosmos is sentient, that everything is a subject, everything is capable of experience, everything is in some sense...
carbon princes and
yes.
calcium princesses and algae and...
Yes, all of those things. I mean, I don't mean to say that carbon actually is a prince, or that calcium actually is a princess. I'm trying to breathe some kind of animistic language into the discourse. You could come up with another story. What matters is not the actual details of the story, but the intention and the spirit behind the atmosphere and the relationship that the story evokes when you hear it. If you read a standard chemical text about carbon dioxide, it'll probably send you to sleep. It's incredibly dry and brittle. Very interesting, of course, if you've developed a scientific outlook, but very dry and brittle and incapable of inspiring anyone but the most arcane ivory tower academic. But if you take those same facts and tell them animistically, as I have tried to do, talking about carbon as a prince and calcium as a princess, suddenly you begin to see these chemical elements as beings that relate to each other, just like we do, as beings that try to find satisfaction in their existences, much as we do. And suddenly, in my experience of teaching Gaia in this way, the whole subject becomes alive and becomes three-dimensional and relational, and people can suddenly begin to understand and relate to the world that they're deeply embedded in. And this brings about a complete relationship with the rest of the world, in which you realize that the world is indeed alive, a great organism. And this gives you a tremendous sense of participation in the world, which is empowering and full of meaning. The most important thing now is not what scientists think about animism. It's getting the sense that we're inside a great living creature out into the general public. That it's okay to feel what you feel in the forest. That what you feel, what you intuit in the forest or out in nature or by the sea actually is telling you something genuine about the world. That the way the light falls on a Norwegian lake, or the feelings you have in the mountains when you're just making your campfire at dusk and you look out onto the horizon lit up with stars, that all of that is a genuine form of communication from the earth, that the earth is actually speaking to you. That's the most important thing for us to learn now as a culture. It's very important for the scientists to do their science, and I wish they would do it in a more animistic spirit. But it doesn't matter if they don't take it on board. It's more important for the general public to take this on board. I don't like the word animism, by the way, but anyway, it's the only word we've got. I can't think of another one. It sounds too much like a cult or a dogma, which it isn't.
And soul world?
Soul, yeah, and soul the world, because anima mundi means, we didn't say this, did we? Anima mundi means soul of the world in Latin. In Greek, the expression was psyche cosmou, the psyche of the cosmos. That was translated by somebody or other in the Roman world into anima mundi, the soul of the world. So we need to re-ensoul the world through telling stories, animated or animistic, I would say, scientific stories. It's as if we steal into we go into the science department at night when no scientists are around, and we get some of their scientific papers. We steal their papers, and we walk out with these papers, and then we breathe life into them. We animate them with soul. We breathe soul into them and release them into the general zeitgeist of the times. And we allow people once again to speak of rocks and atmosphere and carbon and sulfur and all the other things as sentient, as alive. And that we help people to realize that it's all right to participate with the moonlight on a lake, that it actually is full of meaning and communication. This is what we need. This is the deep inner change that we need. Because without that, we won't have the motivation to make the necessary sacrifices and changes. If we don't take on this more soulful approach to the world will force it upon us through wiping out our civilization. This current civilization, with its emphasis on suicidal growth, simply cannot continue. I mean, a 5-year-old child is capable of seeing that. Economists aren't, for some peculiar reason.
Economists would say that it costs like 5% in the long term of the current GDP to counteract the negative influences or the negative externalities of current ongoing growth.
Yes.
I don't believe economists are ready to jump onto the animistic bandwagon just yet, but you think they have to?
No, I don't think they have to. I'd be quite happy if they use that 5% GDP to start putting sulfate aerosols in the air, or try Jim Lovelock's solution of shallow pipes in the oceans. That would be absolutely fine. They don't have to be animistic. Maybe this animism is just my own predilection. I don't want to be a dogmatist, you know. I mean, I have to remember Arnie Ness and be pluralistic. So I don't want to go around converting everyone to animism. I'm just sharing my own perspective. But a mechanist could just as well implement the right solutions. 5% isn't much. It means that instead of something costing 100 krona, it'll cost 105 krona. I mean, that's a small price to pay for saving the earth.
Many people feel it's too expensive, and that if we do the growth now, there will be even more money to use for redeeming these or reversing these changes later on, because as growth goes on until people have actually wealthy enough to do these changes.
But what that point misses is the fact that is the point about the timescales and the almost certainty of abrupt shift in the climate. So we won't, before we get anywhere near reaching that level of wealth, were it possible to do so, of course, because it's premised on extracting ever more resources or wild molecules from the earth. But even long before we could reach that level of growth, the climate system would have collapsed into a hot, dry state in any case. So we have to act now. There's no other option but to act right now, immediately. And by the way, I should add that simply putting aerosols into space or using Lovelock's shallow pipes is not enough, of course. Certainly not the aerosol solution, because we'll still have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which will acidify the oceans. So we're still going to have to reduce our CO2 levels. Well, I might go further than Jim Lovelock when talking about holistic science, because he means more interdisciplinarity, which is a good thing. You know, chemists talking to biologists, etc. But I take it a bit further. I think what we need to do in science now is put together quantities with qualities. Because in science we made a separation between the two. We said the only thing that counts is what can be counted. And anything that cannot be counted or measured doesn't exist. I.e. the qualities don't exist. The qualities are, as we said before, the feelings and intuitions you have when you're in the forest. These can't be quantified, but you feel them. We've been taught to disregard those and disbelieve them. And now I think we need to create a science in which the qualities are given as much weight as quantities. And we're doing this at Schumacher College, where I work, where we have a master's degree in holistic science, where we explore how we can put these two together. So, for example, we'll work with the mathematics of Daisy World, or we'll make a carbon cycle model, but at the same time we'll work with Goethe's science and his intuitive approach to plants and to phenomena. And we'll try and put the two together so that our students then become able to use reason when reason is required, but also to use feeling, sensing and intuition when they are required. So they develop all these four ways of knowing in themselves as equally as possible. And then you don't have thinking anymore, you have thinking, feeling simultaneously. So then you end up with a science that's fundamentally ethical, that will not do certain things because they're unethical, such as certain kinds of genetic manipulation or certain kinds of vivisection would not be done by scientists because the scientists would feel the unethical nature of such activities. At the moment in science, anything that can be done is done in the name of science, irrespective of the ethical implications. Scientists are not trained in ethics. They're not trained in philosophy either. They're just trained to be good servants of the mechanistic metaphor. So in holistic science, we try to heal that mistake by focusing on qualities, the qualities of things, these undefinable but nonetheless real communications from the world of meaning. We combine that with our quantitative approaches to the world as well. Well, the air is in some sense, you could think of it as a sentient creature in its own right, one of the organs of Gaia. That's like our skin is sensitive to touch, so might the air be sensitive to our words. Maybe the air is listening to us in some sense, not in the sense that human ears hear, but nevertheless in some mysterious way carrying our words and thoughts into itself around the world.
Well, it is actually carrying our words in waves, isn't it?
Yes, that's right, it does, yeah. It mediates, that's right. Without air we can't have sound. So the traditional peoples of the world have always spoken of the air as a kind of spirit that connects everything. So this gives us a more meaningful approach to the air, which is not in the slightest bit against or contradicts our scientific understanding of the air. Not at all. In fact, the two mutually enhance each other. I mean, how wonderful to know that the air is 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, etc., etc. You know, to actually know how many of these chemical personalities there are zipping around in the air right here. But also to feel that the air has these more magical, mysterious qualities of perhaps a sort of memory or a soul that connects the whole world. The two are completely consistent with each other. Well, let's talk about light. I think light's easier to focus on. See, and we know this, I'm using some quantum physics here, so it's not all entirely sort of fantasy. We know that what happens when light strikes an object is not what Newtonian physics says it is. Newtonian physics says when photons strike a surface, they bounce off. And the photon is fundamentally unchanged. You see, it's the billiard ball view again. Actually, that's not what happens. What happens is, when a photon strikes a surface, it's absorbed by the surface, and it also it disappears into the quantum void. And then a new photon is reconstituted and emitted by the surface. So that's what happens with reflection. So imagine that a photon is striking a green tree. Lots of photons are striking the tree on a sunny day out in the Norwegian forest. Then the photons are going deeply inside the tree, maybe beyond the tree into this quantum realm, where perhaps they absorb the very essence of treeness itself. And then this essence of treeness now saturates the new photons that are emitted. The new photons are actually tree photons, and they're vibrating treely, if you see what I mean. They then go into your retinas, where they transfer that treely information or that tree sensibility into your whole organism, and so you become tree yourself. So in this sense, light could be a form of communication, deep communication, like glue almost, that glues us to the world. and is a channel for meaning between different beings in the world. This is how I see light. Everything is full of qualities. Everything is a subject. And light is one way in which these qualities travel from one being to another, through our eyes, but also through the air, through sound. I haven't thought about it much with respect to sound. I've thought more about light. But I think there's more and more dissatisfaction amongst young people who are interested in science. They feel more and more that there really is something missing in science. That there's, like I felt when I was a young student, that I loved the science, but I felt that there was something indefinable, something I couldn't put my finger on, that I wanted out of it, that I couldn't get, and I didn't know what it was. I also found the neo-Darwinist interpretations of animal behavior, based on the notion that everything is selfish and is only out to maximize its reproductive success, thoroughly dissatisfactory and almost abhorrent, morally abhorrent.
You studied deer populations, as far as I know, in your PhD.
I did, yeah.
How was the qualities there? How do you treat the qualities in your PhD?
I wasn't allowed to say anything about them. And I remember the qualities taking me by surprise. I wasn't expecting to find them, because I worked on these small little Chinese deer called muntjac, which I fell in love with when I saw them in a wood in southern England. And I used to spend time watching them ruminating, sitting down with their legs tucked up. And they'd close their eyes, and they'd go into a very meditative state. And then a little bolus of food would come up their esophagus. You could actually see it into their mouths, and they would start to chew very quietly. And I would sit there watching, and it was as if a kind of incredible atmosphere of calm and peace would radiate out. Very hard quality to describe. It felt a bit like chamois leather, a very soft, leathery, yellow, warm quality would engulf me as I watched them ruminating. And I became totally captivated by this, totally surprised. I wasn't expecting to find this. And they taught me about a soft, gentle approach to the world, just a total quiet relaxation, a regurgitation of thought, of the day's events, of the events of one's life, a chewing over and a re-swallowing down into the unconscious. So I sat there, engulfed in this atmosphere, and I would, then they'd get up and walk off, and it'd take me a while to snap out of it. And I thought, good God, this is something completely real. And then when I was in my wood, which luckily for me was an ancient woodland, not touched by people for many decades, I would spend hours putting out quadrats to count plants in, to see which plants the deer had been eating, etc. And then, tired of this, I would lean up against a tree and just allow myself to be absorbed by the sound of the wind, by the sight of the leaves, by the whole breathing forest. And suddenly it seemed to me that I connected with the quality of that forest. There was a great personality sucking me into itself through the breath of the air, through its leaves, through its bird song, through its colours. It was just welcoming me into another quality, different to that of the deer, but connected to it, but a more leafy, woody, airy kind of quality, with lots of tentacles feeling into the air. And I would be absorbed into that quality for maybe an hour or so. And then again I would snap out of it and think, oh my gosh, I'm meant to be measuring and doing quadrats. So again I would go through the really difficult exercise of having to put down quadrats and count things. So I ended up with a great mass of numbers sucked out of the forest, almost as if with a vacuum cleaner, sucked out into my notebooks and then into my computer programs that I wrote for analyzing the data, and then into multivariate statistical analyses, which told me a great deal about the deer that I couldn't have found out any other way. So I'm not trying to denigrate that. It was an incredibly useful exercise. I found out some very interesting things about how they used their home ranges, the shapes of their home ranges, when they were active and when they were inactive, what they ate. Tremendously useful. But all of that had to be written up in a very quantitative way, a very dry, objectivist way, and interpreted from a neo-Darwinist perspective. So I had to explain why the deer were doing things, or rather why the genes within the deer were making the deer do things. And the qualities that I'd felt were irrelevant. In fact, I didn't speak to anyone about them. I noticed them but I did nothing with them because there was no room for them. It was only later when I went to Schumacher College and began to work with colleagues there on holistic science that I realized that these qualities were actually as important as the quantities that I'd abstracted from the living world. So now I can see the need to put the two together. So in my dissertation, if I'd been able to do that, I probably would have tried to describe the qualities, maybe through poetry or painting or art or some other kind of artwork, or maybe through a more poetic a kind of prose, and I would have interweaved that with the quantitative data. I mean, if you take this to its extreme, you can have quantitative data expressed poetically. I don't think anyone's ever done this before, and it would be a jolly nice thing to read instead of these dry academic dissertations like mine that nobody ever bothers to read. So there's no need to throw away the quantities. The quantities can be brought to life through a connection with the qualities. And this is what we're trying to do in holistic science.
And this is the way the future would turn if Gaia Inc. and the love of Earth, as you're talking about, becomes a future?
Yes,
future?
And it might have been the way science had developed around the time of Descartes, had it not been for a deliberate effort to repress this approach to science. It could have become a much more integrated form of science. And I think it, well, who knows if it'll become the way of science in the future. That remains to be seen. But there's always that potential.
So, for political reasons, Goethe lost and Descartes won. Is that your...
As to put it crudely, yeah. Or, Descartes wasn't as bad as we think he was, actually. You know, he was a very religious person. And he had his reasons for saying the world was the machine, more for political reasons. But anyway, yeah, to put it starkly like that, yes, Goethe, we would have had a... It wouldn't have been Goethe 0, Descartes 1. It would have been 1-all. You see what I mean? It would have been both together. The mechanistic, quantitative approach blended with the qualitative approach, and each used appropriately as required. And this would have given us an inherently ethical science, and therefore a completely different world. I mean, I remember a lot of my colleagues at Oxford when I was a PhD student, my fellow PhD students, offline would confess to these feelings, and we all loved the animals we were studying. You know, I had people, some of my friends studied capybaras, others hunting dogs, you know, some really exciting animals. Some of them not so exciting, rats and things, but they all had a love of the animals. They all wanted to, they were doing it really to gain some sense of communion and meaning, to find some kind of meaning. But as soon as we got into public discourse or into dissertations or scientific papers, all of that was forgotten. And it was, you know, the usual neo-Darwinist approach. So it was semi-conscious and not developed and not brought into the practice. But you're right, I think all scientists are like this. I mean, most scientists will admit to the importance of intuition in interpreting data. They'll suddenly have a hunch about what a whole load of numbers mean, but they don't cultivate intuition.
Since Albert Einstein, that's a difficult thing to deny, huh?
That's right, yeah, he was a deeply intuitive scientist, and Lovelock too is deeply intuitive. And in holistic science we cultivate the intuition through, one way we do it is through a very careful observation of a plant, let's say. We draw the plant very carefully, and then we close our eyes and we imagine how the plant took shape, how it shaped itself into its fully grown form from the seed, how the seedling developed, how the leaves came out. And this teaches us to think like a plant, to think dynamically. And if you do this properly, you can get an intuitive insight into the nature of the plant, and indeed beyond the plant into the dynamic nature of being itself. So it's a very, very powerful method for awakening your intuitive powers. And then you can bring in the quantitative aspects if you want as well. You can make mathematical models of the development of the plant. And then you end up with a truly holistic understanding that satisfies reason, feeling, sensing and intuition simultaneously. I relate to Gaia by finding a place that's as wild as possible. That's to say, as far away from car noise, machine noise, lawnmowers as I can, a place that's been as little disturbed by humans as possible, and just dwelling in such a place for as long as I can. The best thing for me is actually to escape from Britain altogether and come to somewhere like Norway, where the landscape is much, much freer of human influence, where everything around you, one feels, is more doing its own thing, irrespective of human intervention, although I know, of course, there is human intervention here. That's what I need to really be myself fully.
That could sound a bit anti-human, as if you try to avoid the humans. Are humans evil?
No, not in the slightest. Humans are a wonderful, fantastic species, just that we've got rather out of control. There are too many of us, and we're having too much of an effect on the world. No, but I'm not anti-human in the slightest. I think humans are a wonderful species, but no more wonderful than any other. We're just as wonderful as bacteria. Just imagine, without the action of the bacteria, there'd be no nitrogen cycle. Without nitrogen cycle, well, we couldn't exist. So the microbes are just as wonderful as we are. I like the phrase of Aldo Leopold, we humans are just plain members of the biotic community. We're just plain members. We're not masters or stewards, we're plain members of this great community. And in fact, we can't feel fully human unless we sense that in ourselves. So we're a wonderful species. Our role, I think, is to celebrate Gaia, not to dominate or control her. I mean, I imagine skyscrapers would be draped with greenery. There's a Frenchman, I can't remember his name, who grows plants on the sides of skyscrapers. Factories would be smaller scale, with living machines inside them, with plants inside them, and the workers would work only a few hours a day and then spend most of the time tending the gardens outside in the factory, because we wouldn't need so many industrial products. So everything would be suffused with this Gaian sensibility.
Being guided, what's that?
Well, see, people often say I was inspired by nature, or I felt great when I was outdoors. But I think it goes further than that. I mean, for me, the earth is a great intelligence. It's actually a psyche. I'm not using that metaphorically. I think the earth actually is a psyche. And it's not just me who thinks this. I mean, many traditional, in fact, I would probably say all traditional cultures have said this about nature. It's actually a great psyche. Remember Plato's Psyche Cosmou. So we had it even in our own culture before the scientific revolution. So if the earth is indeed a great psyche, then it's possible for knowledge and intuition of that great psyche to sweep through us. It's possible that it can sweep away our habitual patterns of thought, particularly in these times, our mechanistic patterns of thought, in which we think the whole earth to be nothing more than a dead machine. It's possible for that, all of those thoughts to be swept away by this wider understanding of the earth as fully alive and as a psychological entity. So if I say to you, I was Gaia'd, it means that it wasn't that when I had an important moment in nature, let's say, it wasn't that I projected something out onto nature, which then I felt was grand. It wasn't a projection. It was the other way around. It wasn't a projection from me to the world. It was the world projecting itself into me. So the world is actually an agency with that kind of power, with the power to sweep away and shake habitual patterns of thought. This happened to an American called Aldo Leopold. He's written about this in a beautiful chapter in his book, A Sand County Almanac. The chapter is called Thinking Like a Mountain. And basically, he was involved with wiping out wolves in the United States using the scientific method. And one day he went out into the Gila wilderness in New Mexico with his friends, with rifles, and they sat down to have lunch. And when he sat down to have his lunch, Leopold was still in that mechanistic worldview that we've described earlier. He really thought that we humans had the right to control control nature, and therefore to exterminate wolves if we wanted to. And then they saw some wolves at the bottom of a river. They were sitting on a cliff, and they saw some wolves, and they began to shoot at this pack of wolves, really excitedly. And they killed several of them. And they scrambled down a scree slope to look at one large wolf that was dying. And Leopold said something like this: there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her, the dying wolf, and the mountain. something known only to her and the mountain. And then it's something, he says something like, I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. And then after that, he began to say things like, we humans are just plain members of the biotic community. Or, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, beauty and stability of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. He developed what he called his land ethic, in which he said, we have treated the land as a slave. That's morally wrong, just as it's wrong to treat other human beings as slaves. So what happened to him in that moment must have been pretty big and pretty important if he could shift from that mechanistic worldview, which he had before he sat down to have his lunch in the Gila wilderness on that bright sunny day. Something must have shifted him very, very radically during that experience with the wolf, for him to then go on to develop this land ethic, which he did for the rest of his life, by the way. And what happened, I think, is that he was Gaia'd. In other words, he knew that the mountains, the air, the microbes in the soil, the cactus, the rocks, in fact, all of the animate surroundings had witnessed what he had done and had disapproved of it intensely. So he witnessed, he knew the surrounding environment to be animate and sentient and disapproving, because he says, neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view.